Everyone. Welcome to our webinar today entitled Energy Futures. Uh, I think we have a great group that is joining us online today, and I think we got a very interesting topic. Really what we're looking at today is the fact that the future of energy involves not only the continued emergence of renewables such as wind, solar, and electric alternatives, but also the diminished but necessary reliance on hydrocarbons. Today, our panelists will look forward in time and try to provide us their perspectives on how energy may evolve in the future, including the opportunities and the challenges that it will present. It's my pleasure today to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Ryan Malone. Ryan is a Baylor graduate with a BSME degree. He currently works for BP as the Global Sustaining Projects Capital Manager, and he's also serves on the Board of Advocates for Baylor School of Engineering and Computer Science. In addition, we have two outstanding Baylor faculty members from the School of Engineering and Computer Science with us today. We have Dr. Mack Grady, and who is Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at Baylor University. And we also have Dr. Annette von Jouanne, who is also with the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering, and all. And so it's great to have each of you with us this morning. A couple of things to remind you about. The first thing is the fact that Baylor is the national champion men's basketball team. So I always like to remind that of all participants, as well as the national championship in acrobatics and tumbling. So I always want to make sure everybody knows that in case you may have missed it. In addition, I want to just let you know about the Q&A feature. As we go through and have our panel discussion today, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the QA button. If you have a question, we hope at the end to be able to have time to ask our panelists a few questions. So again, thanks for joining us today, and my thanks to our esteemed panelists for being with us today. To start our discussion, Ryan, I'm going to come to you first. You are with BP, Big Oil, as some people call it. Start us off and just talk about, as a traditional supplier of energy, at a strategic level, how are the integrated hydrocarbon companies, how do they view the opportunities and challenges of renewable energy in their business?
Yeah, Bill and everybody, thanks for the opportunity. It's a great question, and inherent to that, how do you look at opportunities and how do you look at risks inherent in switching from what's been predominantly for the past century a hydrocarbon-based energy infrastructure and plan to something that incorporates renewables and a lower carbon future. And I think inherent to that is the term transition. Transition means it starts somewhere and it ends somewhere, and along the way we make some changes. And I would like to talk just briefly about pace, because I think that'll set the tone for maybe some of the questions and the discussions going forward. What is the pace of that transition? We all now live in a digital and social media transformation right now, which is kind of geared us towards kind of immediate return and immediate change. People's definition of pace is kind of viewed through that lens. Uber, DoorDash, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, we want something and we get it immediately. That's not necessarily what we're talking about in terms of the energy transition. We're talking years and probably decades to get from 100% hydrocarbon or a high percentage hydrocarbon, which we were a few years ago, to one in which we have a more sustainable energy mix. So I think that's going to be the key. Hydrocarbons will be a key element of the overall energy mix. 2050 is a real popular year to talk about. Hydrocarbons are going to be a key part of this energy transition and the energy mix, even in 2050 and beyond. So I think it really is important to talk about that notion of pace and transition, through that lens. So if you can define that transition, kind of where we'll be in 2050, probably a much different place, but that pace will be and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, a couple different scenarios for what that pace is and what might drive that. But I do think, there's a notion or a debate, is this transition going to take place? And my view, and I think some views of many people throughout the industry, including those in oil and gas, is that this transition is inevitable. It's not a choice that we're going to discreetly make. The global narrative around transition is largely fixed. There's legislation, there's social action that's taking place that's going to drive this change. So I think, the opportunity for historical oil and gas companies that are now rebranding themselves as energy companies is, we've been part of this mix for 100 years in delivering energy to the world. And so we know the cities, we know the regions, we know the states, we know the infrastructure, we know the marketplace. And I really do think the opportunity is to lead, in this space because we know the landscape. And I do want to introduce the term olive to those who are a company maybe accustomed to brown and green. Oil and gas is viewed as a brown industry alongside coal and another of others. Fully renewable companies are known as green. These integrated energy companies are olive because they will be hydrocarbon based, but they'll transition to renewable forms of energy through time. So I think there's the challenge. How do you be a leader? And that's the opportunity in the energy transition, while also remaining profitable and returning a share to shareholders with largely our cost streams and our revenue is hydrocarbon based, the sale of hydrocarbon or hydrocarbon product. So that's going to be the main challenge, leading in that transition while also remaining profitable and delivering what the world needs right now.
Thanks, Ryan. I think these things will not happen overnight. I know there's a big push to want these things to happen, but I think you've given us good perspective on kind of a timing challenge that we have. Dr. Grady, let's kind of switch and talk a little bit about utilities. We got talked about oil, but also utilities. What are some of the key opportunities and challenges for utilities seeking to provide reliable but diversified energy in the future?
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Bill. And I'll give you my view of what's happening in the energy business, and particularly in the power grids. And, power grids are roughly the same all around the world, the same equipment, the same handbooks. And but still, of course, there are differences, and one of the big differences is how you generate the electricity. So you have the generators, and then you have the power grid that get it to the customer. So it takes both of those things. And I like to think that really electricity is way too cheap. Personally, if you look back in time, and that's what's shown on the left here is we use a lot of electricity. And especially because the price is pretty cheap. Now you say, well, it's not cheap. Well, think about this in the green box there. We call it 3-to-1 rule. Well, it takes a lot of fuel to produce electricity, yes. And but once you've converted into electricity, then the efficiency is very good getting it to the customer. There's maybe a 3% loss in the grid and maybe another 2 or 3% loss to get it from the substation to your house. And to tell you what a kilowatt hour is, if you worked hard all day in hard labor, you will basically have produced 1 kilowatt hour of energy. And so you think about working all day and you get paid 12 to 14 cents. That's where I get the idea that, well, electricity is pretty cheap. Now, ERCOT, we really have the leader, maybe even in the world as far as renewables is, but certainly in the United States. And I show on the right there, the gas production, or the production electricity, the sources here in ERCOT. And so the biggest one is gas. And then you see there's a coal, Now, I'll show these later on a comparison. And we have some nuclear. We have two different locations that have, each one of them has two generators. And wind power is much bigger than I ever expected 10 years ago, because at that time the thinking was that it wouldn't be ever more than about 10%. And solar is building up too. Now to get it to the customer, that's the other problem. Is just in Texas, ERCOT covers most of Texas, 26 million people, 50,000 miles of transmission lines, 5,000 substations. So it's a combination of the two. Your generators, yes, you can have some local generators, but they're not going to be as efficient as the big ones. You know, that's the way a lot of things work. And if it only costs you 7% or so to get it across from point to point, then that's probably even better what a gas transportation is. Okay, here's something I thought you might like to see, because whatever we decide to do is probably not going to be very much different from the rest of the world, as we were just hearing a while ago. I mean, this is a worldwide issue. And I wanted you to see on the left the USA, and you see that the bold one, gas is still number one, and coal is very big. And wind and solar, not so big. And but we do use quite a bit of electricity compared to most countries, about twice as much. A lot of it's probably air conditioning, and a lot of it's because it's probably quite a bit cheaper here. Now, I'm not saying ERCOT is not in the USA, all right, but ERCOT has quite a different profile. We have, of course, the USA has 19% nuclear. We only have 5%. I'd really like to see that to grow, because nuclear is clean. You know, we have the resources and it doesn't pollute. But we have essentially 0%. There's a little bit. Gas is number one. Coal is rather small in ERCOT now. And wind is 29%. Now, 29%, compare that to all these other numbers on there, 6, 5, 17. Even in Germany, 17%. We have a lot more than that, and it's growing significantly. And we've just really got started in solar, and it's already 6%. So then you look over at France, 71% nuclear, and they were really thinking ahead. And they make a lot of money selling this to the other parts of Europe too. So that's their big special one. And they have hydro that's really impossible to have at this latitude. They have some areas where the tides are 20 feet and above. And so they actually have some hydro generation that, you know, works with the tide. And so they could probably have more of that. The further north you get, the easier that is. And look down at the rest of them are all pretty small. They're not really big, too big into wind or solar, because they have all this nuclear, these nuclear generators. Then take their neighbor, Germany, not so big in nuclear, but very big in coal. And I think their air quality does suffer some from that, where nuclear really doesn't affect air quality. And Germany also has quite a bit of wind, but not nearly what ERCOT does. So I wanted y'all to see this. And at the bottom, the per capita consumption for a year, you can see we in the US does about twice as much as they do. And it's probably because of the price. Even if you have local generation, you never expect to get rid of the power grid. And the reason is because you can produce in large generators and get it to the location with the losses aren't that big. And now transmission line, as you see, you think of that as the power is going down through the wire. Actually, it's not. There's very little power traveling through the wire. It's a guide. The power comes from the magnetic field and electric field that wrap themselves around these wires when the current is flowing. You can't see them, and it's rather like magic that the power is moving through the air like this. Even if it wasn't air, it would move through, and that's what makes it so efficient. And so what happens is the power actually is flowing downstream, from the direction it's being uh, uh, directed to. And the wire is simply there as a waveguide. It's a guide. And by the time you get to the ground, the electric field is safe, not enough to hurt you, but just don't get on too many ladders if you climb up. Okay, so we have the grid, they have the right of way. We would be crazy to let that, go away. And so I expect us to have large generators around. Now the question is what kind? Well, Texas is number one in wind power, certainly in the United States and probably at most other places. And the top left shows that we have, this is for the US, and the purple areas are the very best. And so you can see that the Panhandle, actually West Texas parts, and then all the way up, very good wind country. And we're fortunate, ERCOT, even though ERCOT doesn't serve customers in the Panhandle, they have a lot of wind farms in the Panhandle. They bring them down on the transmission lines. And if the transmission lines, if you need to have more wind, you have to build more lines. What it does is it's like making them closer to the central Texas. By adding more lines, it's electrically closer. So we have a lot of potential going up and down the middle of the country there. And the two grids, the eastern and western, come together in that. So that area of the country is kind of on the edge for both eastern and western. And tying grids together is not a good idea. In fact, the better idea is to keep grids about the size of ERCOT in case there's a disaster of some kind, they don't bring the other ones down. So we're number one in wind power. The wind generator, everybody's seen them. There it is, except it's down at the bottom. What you're seeing is the shadow. And from Google Earth, you can see wind farms and you can figure out how tall they are with the shadow and all that. And also, I would have never thought this would happen. There is a quite a big wind farm only 20 miles east of Waco, and they're putting in big 3 megawatt machines. And most of the machines you see are 1.5, and they're made for less of a wind average. The curve at the top shows that as you go up in speed, wind speed, the output of a turbine goes up by the cube. So if you double the wind speed, the wind power you can get is 8 times as big. So when you look at a map on the left, that shows average wind speed, but it's not linear at all. You must go to the areas that have the good wind. All right, solar is really big in West Texas, and this is near the town of Iran. It's out there around the Pecos, and you can see it Google Earth, and it's really high tech. Now you can see that you don't the panels themselves. This would fit into a regular room, each one of them, and but they're actually tilted so that they move with the sun, and you can really tell the difference in that. It costs more to do it that way, but what they gain is by capturing more in the morning and in the afternoon, and there's a better price then. So if you've ever been driving west toward La Mesa and on into New Mexico, there's a huge solar farms going in out there. Plus there's wind all around it too. So, well, what's the downside? We love our wind, we love our solar, but it's not the best thing for the grid. Now, this graph at the top shows a number of weeks here, and that's through just a few days ago. So it's April 21st to 16th. And the scale and the vertical is gigawatt. Now the peak normally in the summer is about 70 gigawatts. So you see there was one peak there as we're kind of moving into, out of spring that hit up to 62. Now you won't believe this, but the winter peak during the disaster would have been higher than any summer peak we've ever seen. It reached almost 70 gigawatts. So it was huge, huge. And so the problem was it was huge and it lasted a long time. Now, look at the variations. Like if you own a motor, you know, when you're traveling in a car, you like to move at a regular speed. Well, generators can't do that because the load requirements are going up and down with that graph. Okay, but they have a high average value, so it's like they're at already a high speed, and so then they can vibrate some and go up and down. When you look now at the generation, at the bottom, the blue is conventional, and then the green is the wind, and you can see that wind sometimes is bigger than the blue. And I would have never expected that to happen, but it does. And now you have solar coming in, which is rather, rather steady. You'll have days without solar. But I want to point out in the days 121 to 122, you see where the wind was down for several days. That was almost a disaster in ERCOT. It was almost like another winter storm, but it wasn't cold. The reason is the wind dropped down, but you see how that load was peaking up, and they thought it was coming, and they were already prepared to deal with that, even though the weather was perfect. So what you got is you look at the top curve and the blue curve. You see that your regular generation is have to do the same up and down cycles, but it doesn't get that average that it gets, and that's where you lose efficiency. So we love the solar and wind, but you have to recognize that you can't mistreat the other generators. So what they do is they keep generators on, but generators that you don't want to run them below 80% because they're not efficient. And so they can't afford to keep them very many on because it would be inefficient. And so they're always in the process of having more come on for tomorrow, more come on for the next day. And it makes it tougher for them. It's a tough business. So, but we can work this out. It could be something like prices. When you had a higher demand for the conventional generation, you probably have to pay more. Personally, I think electricity is too cheap. I think we can solve that problem. Storage, maybe. I'm not a real big fan of batteries. You have car batteries, and they cost a lot of money to store energy. In other words, the best stored energy is in fuel, way better than batteries. So these are problems that we deal with. ERCOT's working like nobody else, and actually they're like the world looks at what they're doing. Okay. And so we can be very proud of that.
Well, thank you, Dr.
Yes,
Grady. That's
hope I didn't talk too long.
No, you did fine. Dr. von Jouanne, tell us about some of the impacts as we develop renewable energy, and also maybe some of the challenges that you're seeing and some of the things that you're doing in that area.
Sounds great. So first off, as Dr. Grady was emphasizing, ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, is an excellent testbed as we look at the development of renewables. He mentioned that we are really leading in the United States with regards to percent penetration. And in fact, we have, for several hours at a time, over 50% penetration of renewables, wind and solar, particularly wind. And so that's an exciting place to be. And when you ask about the impacts, so Dr. Grady also mentioned cost. And so as we see increased penetration of renewables, we will see an increased cost of electricity. And I'll share some reasons for that. The first is, as we mentioned, that variability, right? We know that the wind can ramp up and then the wind can ramp down. And so we need to be able to buffer that variability with standby generation. And so in reality, we could go to a much higher percentage penetration of renewables with more generation on standby. But that costs additional money that comes, just a moment. that comes at an additional cost. And so we need to keep that in mind. And in addition, if we were to have additional spinning reserve generation on standby, we could also think about, like Dr. Grady mentioned, additional energy storage. But there are challenges with that, and we need to think about how we can do that with long lifetimes, with higher energy efficiency. So that's a big area that that still needs a lot more research. So there we talk about key impact is this additional cost. Now, when we think about challenges, an interesting challenge that we have with renewables, such as wind and solar, is the fact that these are inverter-based resources that do not inherently provide what is called inertia. And so when we talk about power systems inertia, we're talking about the energy that is stored in these large rotating generators, okay? And that energy can really be quite valuable when you have a sudden disturbance event, when you have a fault, when you lose a generator. That energy stored in those large rotating generators can make up for that power lost and can allow us time to adjust the operating points of generation around the system. So as we go to higher and higher percent penetration of renewables, we're losing that inherent inertia. And we need that in order to what we call to maintain stability of the system. And so we talk about stability. That means all the lights are staying on, the power is staying on. And this is another challenge. And I want to introduce this concept of stability. And what stability means in the power system is that our generation matches our load demand plus the losses, as Dr. Grady mentioned. And it's important that we have that, that balance of supply and demand. And the importance of that is to maintain the frequency of the system. So we're all familiar with our operating frequency here in the United States is 60 hertz, 60 cycles per second. That's our design operating point for these generators. And so what happens when we enter an imbalanced situation, for example, when people suddenly stop using power. So for example, let's say we come to the end of the national basketball championship game and Baylor has won and everybody turns off the television. And what happens then is that the load decreases. And so the frequency of the system actually increases. Okay, and then we adjust generation around the system. However, when we go into a situation where we suddenly have more load demand, we enter a situation of, for example, we suddenly start using more power because it's very hot, or everyone starts using more power because it's very cold, like what happened with the Texas deep freeze. So when everyone starts using more power, the frequency decreases. And so if that frequency decreases too much without additional generation coming onto the system, if we don't have that ability, then we need to do what's called under frequency load shedding in order to allow that frequency to rise back up. And so that is what we experienced during the Texas deep freeze. So here's where the challenge is with renewables and stability is that renewables, when they are operating at their maximum output, for example, based on weather conditions, wind and sun, we call them that they're not dispatchable. I can't suddenly command more power if it's already operating at its maximum capacity. However, we can operate renewables strategically using power electronics that we actually operate them purposefully lower than their maximum output capability, giving ourselves about 5 to 10% reserve. so that in the case of a disturbance, an event, we lose generation, we have sudden increase in load demand, I can now command those renewables to give me more power. And that allows them to participate in that frequency regulation like our traditional generators have in the past. And so as you can imagine, this is an economic trade-off with regards to producing the most amount of energy at any given time versus being able to provide that type of frequency support in a disturbance. So I'll go ahead and hold off there. There might be some more questions about that, but
Great. No, thank you. Let me, I'm going to work in some questions from some of our participants to show them that I'm watching that and all that. Ryan, I'm going to come to you. We've got a question here about, how do you see the future of natural gas? The demand for it, the price for it, and also, what's your outlook on natural gas?
Yeah, Bill, great question. I think, fundamentally looking at hydrocarbon as a base, you can already establish that it's going to be there for a while, and it's going to be the key component, of the mix. I do think regionally, and depending on where you are in certain emerging markets, where the natural gas is, where the distribution centers are, the demand for natural gas is going to increase. Globally, if you look across, probably every country, every continent, every city, that factor of energy as part of the overall energy equation tied to natural gas will increase. It will be probably more prominent in some areas compared to others. If you look at Asia Pacific region, particular hotspots, Eastern and Western Europe, tied to where some of the natural gas fields are, the transmission. You can also liquefy it in terms of liquefied natural gas, LNG, and the transportation of that. So I think the markets for natural gas overall, you'll see that beginning to probably be a bigger factor in the overall energy mix, particularly when it comes to electricity demand and keeping the power on in some key emerging markets. It will probably be regionally, variant, which is why our cost of supply is so low here in the U.S. compared to where it is elsewhere in the world, but also why you're seeing a greater uptick here in the U.S. Compared to coal and some of the other resources. So that's probably a quick answer, to it, Bill.
Good, thank you, Ryan. Dr. Grady, and this may also, Dr. von Jouanne, you may want to speak a little bit to this. Dr. Grady, you showed those slides, and I guess and one of the things that stands out, for instance, in France, their use of nuclear. And as we look at renewables and how that's coming into play, but we also understand its reliability and trying to balance that with the demand. What is the role of nuclear and what's the importance of doing nuclear? Can we really get the balance right and the reliability right without having more nuclear?
I think it's a necessary thing to do, and it's really been given a bad reputation. Yes, there's been some bad events because of poor construction and handling, but there are many nuclear plants. I had a map of France, and they have like 15 or 20 around the country, and they're just hard to beat. If it's up to me, I'd start building them now. But yes, because they can. There was a failure on one during the winter storm, but it was because of water that would come in to cool the plant down had frozen up. They weren't expecting that down on the Gulf, and so, but it took it out for a day or so. But yes, I'm a big fan of nuclear, and it doesn't pollute the air, and like the other things do. So we can use it all. And like Annette was saying, we can figure out how to use renewables so that we take away some of the difficulties of scheduling conventional generation. And so I wouldn't turn away anything, but I sure wish we'd bring more nuclear into the problem. And France did this, and they're very proud of it, and they make a lot of money from it too.
Yeah, they do. So, Dr. von Jouanne, what do you see in terms of, the waste of some of the renewable energy? You got battery technology. How do you deal with the batteries after they die? You got wind technology, these big blades, many of them made out of fiberglass, don't break down. You got nuclear waste and all. What are some of the challenges and what are some of the potential things that you're seeing in that space?
Well, I think absolutely, as we're seeing here, we need innovation on every front, which includes innovation in recycling and in really enabling the longest lifetimes for these technologies. Because if you can get those long lifetimes, that these become cost effective over a long period of time, and you have good recycling in place, then this can really make a lot of sense. And so, in my research, that's one of the areas that we're looking at is advanced battery technologies that will enable longer lifetimes, faster charging, would enable more electrified flight, this type of thing. But that end use, repurposing these batteries for other applications, that type of thing, and recycling are very key.
Okay, good. Dr. Grady, as we talked about nuclear, all of a sudden I've got quite a few questions popping up. Do you know how France manages their nuclear waste?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't know where they get the fuel and what they do with it.
Yeah.
But I'm not a nuclear engineer, but in my opinion, managing that is a lot better than hurting the air quality. So, all of them are going to have a downside, but that's a good question. I'll try to find out. I have some
Well,
former students over there.
okay. No, I think that's an obvious question that comes out
Of course it
because
is.
and that works with that because one of the issues that regulators and on the political side talks about as we get into that. Ryan, as you look at how and why do you think hydrocarbons are here to stay? You hear a lot of people saying they need to just go away entirely. Do you really think that's feasible? They're going to always be here to stay. Give us some thoughts around that.
Bill, fundamental to the whole, and probably why the energy transition is such a hotly debated topic. I think there's people that want hydrocarbon to be the dominant source of energy across the world for forever, and there are those that want to see it go away tomorrow. And the answer is probably what we talked about, in between. It's going to be a transition. It's going to be time, but it's going to be hydrocarbon, both in terms of oil and natural gas and the products that they produce, will be, the dominant energy provider for the foreseeable future. We can continue to do it better. We can continue to do it cleaner, in a more focused manner. But what I think it comes down to, there's a big theme emerging here, both in what Dr. von Jouanne and Dr. Mack have been talking about, and it's cost. Cost to society, cost to emerging countries, and what that's built around. And the reality is, the energy infrastructure and hydrocarbon supply has been the dominant, source of energy for the past century, and therefore our infrastructures built around it, our market and our trading infrastructure is around it, and it's incredibly complex. With that complexity and with the dominance of that infrastructure comes the benefit of getting it relatively low cost. I often say if you could really plot what it takes to get a molecule of hydrocarbon from 30,000 feet below 7,000 feet below the ocean surface and get it, drill it, transport it, refine it, transport it again, put it into a usable product and sell it, you'd be surprised by how cheap that is. But it's what keeps emerging markets going. It's what keeps emerging nations kind of fueled because that cost of supply is relatively cheap now. changing that infrastructure will come with a cost. And I think we've seen that through some of what others have said, around we can get there. It will take some time. And really what I think it is, though we'll find greater efficiencies, that there's a few models built to that question. How long will hydrocarbon be around? And I think different think tanks, different energy companies have different definitions, but in my mind and that of BP, it really falls into four categories for how long hydrocarbon will be around. There's the rapid transition scenario. I think, and in terms of rapid, again, keep in mind pace, but that there's policy measures and that there's a really significant increase in carbon price. And this leads to something like 70% reduction in emissions by 2050. And to get that reduction in emissions, you transition to different sources of energy quicker than you would. That reduction in carbon would come with a price. You would have to look at your tax structures in different companies. You'd have to look at liabilities. You'd have to look at government incentives to do that. But that's one scenario in which, in that rapid transition scenario, you could see hydrocarbon phased out, relatively quickly over the next 30 to 40 years to become a minority player. There's the net zero scenario, and this would be massive policy measures put in place and really significant shifts in societal behavior, even beyond what we're seeing now in places outside of the US, that could get you somewhere around 90 to 95% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. It'd have to be an inflection, something that we haven't seen, something that we don't quite anticipate, but that could see hydrocarbon, become somewhere in the low single digit, double digits of the energy mix in terms of percentage. So those are two. The third is business as usual. And this is one in which government policies, technologies, societal and social preferences involve kind of what we've seen in the past largely, which is very, very incrementally. And under this scenario, because we like cheap supply of energy, because government policies may not advance, and because maybe our societal view doesn't trend globally as much as it does in some regions, you maybe only see a 10% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. And in that scenario, hydrocarbon would, and in terms of the overall energy mix, would largely be unchanged from where it is today. It'd decrease a little bit, and you'd see some incremental uptick in renewables, but it wouldn't change that much. And then there's probably the fourth scenario, which is a delayed and disorderly scenario, which is you get business as usual for 5 to 10 years, and people beginning to stew on this a little bit, and then you get a rapid transition in which global nations across the world start implementing policy measures. Society decides it wants a different energy mix. You put really high taxes or liabilities in place. You increase incentives. What this does do, and why it's called disorderly, is it does come with a really high cost of supply. So I think you'd see energy prices increase overall. You'd see emerging countries that we're doing pretty well on the socioeconomic scale begin to kind of plateau or degrade a little bit. But you could reach, that 70 to 95% carbon reduction by 2050 and do that. So those were the four. You could either do it in the two scenarios pretty rapidly and immediately. One, you kind of maintain it. And the fourth is you delay it for a bit, and then all of a sudden, the next 5 to 10 years, you make a big pivot. So I really do think, Bill, we're probably approaching, within the next 5 to 10 years, that major inflection that will show the trajectory of where we'll be, and that'll determine how much hydrocarbon will be, part of the mix. But there is no scenario in which hydrocarbon isn't a fairly significant player for the next 10 years, probably 20, and in the 30 and 40 under most scenarios and kind of market outlooks. It still remains, if not dominant, pretty close to the dominant energy source, and that includes natural gas out to about 2050 or so.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of view this a little bit like technology. We have our phones, we have our tablets, and our PCs. Nobody ever talks about mainframe computing anymore, but mainframe computing is still alive and well.
Great point.
And
Great point.
so I think as we look to the future of energy, It may be that we see a lot of stuff, but hydrocarbons is going to be sitting there in the background one day in the future, probably not unlike mainframe computing. We won't see it, won't talk about it much, but it has to be there because of the infrastructure that we have. So, Dr. von Jouanne, as we look at things like electric cars, I have a question for one of our panelists, and the continued electrification of the economy and what we do we have enough generation capacity to stay up with all of that? I know you this is an area you work in, so you probably have some thoughts on that.
Yes, and in fact, there is an exciting aspect about shifting that fuel source from fossil fuels, which can have a bit of vulnerability, to domestically generated power. And so getting that power from electricity. And it's absolutely an exciting field as we look at responsibly increasing electric vehicles. And also, I want to mention the fact that those batteries can provide power to the grid during these kind of low generation events. And so that's another very exciting research area, what we call vehicle to grid support. And so in that case, for example, electric vehicle owners could have contracts with the utility of when that could happen and actually be able to provide power during peak demand times and charge those electric vehicles during low demand times. For example, in the middle of the night, that kind of thing, when we have high wind, that kind of thing. And so there is an interesting opportunity there. And yes, if we do this responsibly, our generation will be able to keep up with the additional load of electric vehicles.
Okay, great. I've had several questions talking about geothermal and the potential of geothermal energy. And so just because of the number of questions I've got about that, we haven't really talked about that. Does anybody have any thoughts on geothermal energy among the panelists?
Hey, well, it is, as you dig down deep enough, I mean, and I think you can take some advantage of in the earth. Like, have you ever thought about building a house and digging so deep that it would, you could either get warm air or maybe you could get cooler air in the summertime, and there's a big earth below us. So I don't know too much about it, but it seems like there has some potential.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's great. I think in terms of looking at that, I guess in terms of just grid stability and all, we've talked about increasing prices to get the right balance and the right mix. Any other thoughts in terms of grid stability that we need to look at as we continue in the future? And one of the things there is, and I think it's been mentioned, having the investment to ensure we've got the capacity or the reserve capacity to be able to meet peak demand. And so what other things do regulators and generators need to be thinking about there?
Well, what we call spinning reserve. Now, things changed during ERCOT when we went to more of the market type system. And so when we had just, 5 or 10 utilities that were owned all the generation, that they always insisted we have 20% reserve on turning online. So what that means, and the nuclear plants were still allowed to go at their maximum power all the time. So what happened was when you operate a generator at 80% instead of 90%, it's not quite as efficient. And so you have to give up a little bit of efficiency to keep that spinning reserve online. Now, and spinning reserve, and that's what stability is all about. Stability means you can keep the frequency steady. If it drops down even by half of a hertz, a lot of generators will trip off after a matter of minutes because there'll be damage. And same thing if it went higher. And You may not know that a generator, it has an inertia, but that inertia is so that if you all of a sudden remove the, whatever's turning it, steam or whatever, it could produce 5 seconds worth of full power, and then it's a dead stop. They don't have a lot of inertia.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, the grid is very sensitive, and of course the load is changing all the time. So it's nervous. It's very nervous. And there's not that much stored energy. So as Annette was saying, if we can use electronics to take advantage of the wind turbines and the panels and have them drop from 100% to 90%, but still be able to quickly produce a lot more power, we could solve a lot of this problem. But that means that they're going to have to agree to making less money, so.
Okay. So Ryan put on, yeah, we're getting close to the end here. So I'm going to just ask just a general question. So, you work for one of the multinational integrated oil companies, and what do you think? How do you think multinational energy companies will look in the future as energy do? Are they going to be more focused on the hydrocarbons? Are they going to play in renewables as well? And so, how do you see these multinationals looking in the future?
Yeah, Bill, it's a really good question. I think you made a great distinction between multinational vertically integrated companies. Vertically integrated meaning you got integrated supply and trading that deals in energy trades and deals. You've got refineries that refine the product into different things like plastics and fuels and aviation, and you got your upstream, which actually finds and produces the hydrocarbon from oil and natural gas. So I think what you're seeing now from most of the vertically integrated and the multinational companies is a transition in what they're talking about to varying degrees. And I won't name names, but there's some on one end of the spectrum that says they'll dominantly be hydrocarbon for the next 20, 30, 40 years, though they will look to reduce the carbon footprint of their operations. And you've got those on the other end of the spectrum that said, we're going to really transition into an energy company, and we're going to see a smaller percentage of our profits through time coming through hydrocarbon as we learn to do renewables and lower carbon energy sources a lot better. But they're all saying it, to some degree, that we are going to look different by 2050 than we do now. There's just varying degrees of how they play in the market. I do know for BP, we do have an ambition to get to net zero by 2050. Even then, it does mean, we're going to be producing significantly less hydrocarbon, but we still will be producing hydrocarbon. There's some integrated companies like us in that mix, and there's others that said, we're not going to follow that path. They're all going to do it. And I think really, everybody's going to have their own secret sauce for where they want to focus in and be a part of that energy transition. For BP, I think we're probably, towards the end of looking for a faster transition. And for that, we're focusing on 3 major streams to 2050. And those are low carbon electricity and energy uses. So we do want to build scale in renewables, bioenergy, wind. We do want early positions in hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, CCUS, which some of you may be familiar with that term, some of you may not. It's carbon trading is going to become a huge element in the future as governments kind of tweak their policies. We do want to leverage convenience and mobility. So ultimately, we supply energy to customers, and we do have a retail arm. So I think leveraging that through EV charging stations, scaling our fuel chains depending on where we operate, whether it's aviation fuels or cleaner fuels or whatever that might be. But there is still a big element of our strategy, Bill, called resilient and focused hydrocarbons, which is it's going to get smaller. It may actually be just as profitable as we really focus at the regions that make us the most money from hydrocarbons. And I also think most of these vertically integrated multinational companies are really adept at understanding the local content of the countries in which they operate. Some will transition a lot quicker to renewables in some areas, and other areas that are going to rely on hydrocarbon a bit more heavily because of the infrastructure, and they need that cost of supply to remain low. We may, stay a little bit more focused in hydrocarbon in those regions. So, I do see it shifting. Everybody in the integrated, kind of energy company realm does have a plan to get to 2050. I do think overall hydrocarbon, as a focus of revenue will decrease through time up through 2050 and beyond. It's just different companies have a different view of the market. And it's probably tied to those four scenarios. How quickly do you believe that we're going to transition, and make that transition happen? And to some extent, each company's got to make their own decision on what do you believe. I don't know if anybody can predict it. I'm sure we'll be surprised by it, but that's why we're partners in some areas, but we're also competitors looking to try to get it right for that future and for our shareholders. So we'll wait and see. I know BP's got a plan. I think it's a good plan, but other operators have plans too, and with their own merit.
Okay. Well, we're at the top of the hour, so I want to kind of draw this to a close. And I think, there's been a lot of discussion about 2050, and I assume that, we'll have our grandchildren can have a webinar in 2050 and talk about whether or not we've met any of these objectives and things around that. I do want to thank our panelists, Dr. Grady, Dr. von Jouanne, and Ryan. Appreciate all the questions that came in, and appreciate everybody that tuned in. Again, continue to look for future webinars put on by the Baylor Alumni Association. In addition, in-person events are coming in the fall. And in fact, in Houston, we're going to have one honoring Dr. Terry Manus on June 22nd that will be in person, and also a webinar. So look for that. And so again, thanks everybody for joining in. Thank you again to our panelists. And as always, sic 'em Bears.